The sharp click of Calvina's boots echoed down the dim, concrete corridor of the municipal shelter, each step slicing through the stale air like a metronome of memory. Harsh fluorescent lights flickered above her, casting long shadows against rows of rusting cages. She wore a faded beige trench coat, one she had kept for over 20 years, the same one she wore the morning she buried her sister, and the same one she put on today without fully understanding why. There was something tugging at her, something wordless and cold that led her to this place without explanation. She hadn't planned on coming. But now, here she was, face to face with a past she didn't yet recognize. At the very end of the row, behind a cage more corroded than the rest, sat a German shepherd. His coat was thick, dark with shades of gold, but dulled with dust and time. His posture was poised, still, unnaturally still, as if he'd been waiting. His name, handwritten in faded red ink on a bent metal tag, read Hollis. But Calvina didn't need the nameplate. Something inside her tightened. The way he looked at her, it wasn't the gaze of a lost dog. It was heavier than that. Sharper. Like he was holding back recognition in protest. Drew, the young shelter assistant, had told her that Hollis had been picked up on a desolate back road 3 months ago. No tags, no microchip, no signs of abuse, just an eerie stillness that made the staff uneasy. He didn't bark like the others. He didn't lunge or beg for attention. Hollis simply watched. Observed. Waited. Calvina didn't ask questions when she asked to see him. She barely spoke. It wasn't curiosity that brought her, it was something deeper, something primal. And as she stepped closer to the cage, her heart drummed a warning she couldn't ignore. The moment their eyes met, the noise of the shelter melted into silence. The barking, the scratching, the hum of the overhead lights, gone. In its place was a silence thick with history. Hollis tilted his head slightly, ears perked just enough to register her presence, yet not enough to show emotion. His eyes weren't pleading or frightened. They were guarded, filled with a kind of quiet judgment. Calvina froze. There was something painfully familiar about those eyes. And in a single blink, she was drowning in a memory she couldn't fully grasp. She stepped closer until her hand hovered inches from the cage. The smell of rust and damp straw clung to the metal. Hollis didn't move. He simply looked. And then, with a calm deliberateness that felt almost human, he turned his head away from her. Not out of fear. Not out of disinterest. But out of something far more deliberate. Rejection. Calvina felt it land like a blow. Her breath caught, and her chest ached with a heaviness she hadn't known in years. It wasn't just a dog turning away. It was someone saying, "You don't get to come back now." And in that single moment, Calvina knew. Hollis remembered her. He knew exactly who she was. And he had made a choice. If that gave you chills, just wait for what's next. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss Hollis, the dog who remembers. Calvina and Hollis's story is just beginning, and it'll move you deeply. Calvina didn't move for nearly a minute. Her hand remained frozen near the bars, hovering in a limbo of hesitation. The sharp coldness of the air around her suddenly felt unbearable, like it had sunk beneath her coat and wrapped itself around her ribs. She slowly pulled her hand back and let it fall by her side, her fingers curling into a loose fist. The rejection wasn't just in Hollis turning away, it was in how still he stayed afterward, like nothing about her presence mattered anymore. And yet, deep down, she knew that wasn't true. She could feel it in the ache behind her eyes, in the heat building in her throat. He remembered. But memory didn't always bring forgiveness. She turned to Drew, who had been standing awkwardly a few feet away, pretending to be busy with the clipboard in his hand. "Where exactly did you find him?" she asked, her voice low, hollow. Drew flipped through some pages, then glanced at her. "Just off Route 17, near the woods out past Landon Falls." He was sitting beside a rusted mailbox. wouldn't move. We had to lure him with chicken. Calvina swallowed hard. That road. She hadn't driven down Route 17 in over 12 years. Not since the night everything fell apart. Not since the name Marvin stopped being spoken aloud in her home. Marvin had been her husband for 17 years, and the only man she'd ever truly loved. He was quiet, patient, and carried a sadness that Calvina never dared to ask about. He had shown up one afternoon with a puppy in his arms, a German shepherd runt that no one wanted because of a weak back leg. "He's tough," Marvin had said with a tired smile. "He's just gotta be shown how to trust." They named the dog Hollis. Or rather, Marvin did. He said the name came to him in a dream, and it stuck. But Hollis had been more than a pet. He had been a part of their attempt to hold on, to fill the silence that was slowly growing between them. Years passed, and things unraveled. Calvina didn't remember when she stopped talking to Marvin the way she used to, only that one day they were in the same house but miles apart. There were fights, short words, long silences, and eventually there was a letter. Marvin had left. No goodbye, no explanations. Just a note, and Hollis gone with him. Calvina never found either of them. She told herself she didn't care. That if he could leave without a word, then she could forget him just as easily. But that wasn't true. The grief had rooted itself in her bones, and time had only buried it deeper, not erased it. Now here she was, more than a decade later, face to face with the ghost of a decision she never had the courage to confront. Her knees felt weak. She sat down slowly on the cold floor across from the cage, ignoring the discomfort of the concrete beneath her. Hollis still didn't look at her. But something in his body had changed. His ears were no longer alert. They drooped slightly now, a sign not of calm, but of withdrawal. Calvina let out a breath, shaky and slow. "I never forgot you," she whispered. "And I never stopped wondering what happened to you." He didn't respond, of course. But a soft sound left his throat, a low, brief exhale. Almost like a sigh. Not forgiveness. Not warmth. Just exhaustion. The kind that only comes from years of waiting and being let down. Calvina felt her chest tighten again. There was a story in those eyes, a history of pain and abandonment. But the worst part? She was in it. That night, Calvina couldn't sleep. The image of Hollis turning away from her replayed in her mind like an old film reel, grainy, silent, and painfully unresolved. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the hum of the refrigerator in the next room the only sound accompanying her thoughts. Her house felt colder than usual, the silence sharper. She hadn't felt this particular kind of restlessness in years. It wasn't just regret. It was the sensation that something had been left undone for far too long. And now, the past was knocking, no barking, from behind a steel cage. She got up before dawn and made tea she wouldn't drink. On the kitchen counter sat a dusty photo frame, half obscured by unopened mail. Inside it, a younger Marvin, smiling faintly, standing beside a workbench with Hollis as a pup clumsily resting his paws on Marvin's boot. Calvina hadn't looked at that photo in over a decade. She used to keep it hidden in a drawer, but some part of her had brought it out months ago, without even knowing why. Now she stared at it with new eyes. There had been something gentle in Marvin. A stillness. But that stillness had always come with weight, like he was carrying more than he let on. She'd asked him once, early in their marriage, why he woke in the middle of the night so often. He'd only said, "Some things follow you, even when you think you outran them." She wondered now what had followed him the night he left. And more than that, why take Hollis? Marvin had never explained his decision, but taking the dog with him always felt like a message. Not of anger, but of retreat. As if Marvin didn't want to go alone. Or maybe Hollis was the only soul left who truly understood him. Calvina tried to remember their last conversation. Something about the garage door needing repair. Something so mundane it hurt to think that might have been their last real exchange. No apologies. No warnings. Just silence, and then absence. But now Hollis was back. Without Marvin. Found beside a rusted mailbox on a forgotten road, waiting for something or someone that never came. The implications of that haunted her. What had happened to Marvin? Did he abandon Hollis? Did he die? Was there another note, another vanishing, just like before? Questions swirled in her chest like storm clouds. And the more she tried to dismiss them, the louder they became. She couldn't let it go. She needed answers. And she needed to earn Hollis's trust again. Not just for the dog, but for what he might represent. The next morning, Calvina returned to the shelter. She brought boiled chicken in a glass container, the same way Marvin used to prepare it when Hollis was just a pup. As she walked down the same corridor, her heart pounding with a strange mixture of hope and dread, she wasn't entirely sure what she was more afraid of, that Hollis would still turn away, or that he wouldn't. When Calvina entered the shelter that morning, she was greeted with the same cold fluorescent glow and the faint, constant whimpering of dogs who had forgotten what it meant to be wanted. The air smelled like bleach and wet fur, and the floor beneath her feet was slick from the morning cleaning. She walked past the cages without looking into them, her focus set on one destination. The container of chicken in her hands was still warm, wrapped in a towel the way Marvin used to do, like it mattered that it stayed tender. It was ridiculous, maybe, but it felt important. This wasn't just about food. It was a peace offering, a memory she hoped Hollis still carried. Hollis was in the same position as before, sitting, not quite relaxed, but no longer tense. His head tilted slightly when he saw her, and for the briefest moment, his tail moved once. Just once. It was subtle, like the stirring of a breeze that could disappear just as easily. Calvina stopped in front of the cage and knelt down slowly, her knees creaking with the weight of age and history. She said nothing at first. She just opened the lid of the container and set it on the floor beside her. The scent filled the air, rich, familiar. Hollis sniffed once, then looked back at her. This time, he didn't look away. She opened the cage door just a crack, enough to slide the container inside without crossing a line. "I remember how you used to wait under the table," she said softly. "You'd pretend not to care, but the moment Marvin dropped a piece, you'd be there before it hit the floor." Her voice trembled, not from cold, but from the sheer pressure of emotion behind those words. Hollis inched forward, sniffing the container cautiously. He didn't eat right away. Instead, he glanced at her again, this time with something more complicated in his eyes. Recognition, yes, but also hesitation. As if he, too, was unsure whether she deserved forgiveness. Calvina felt the tears press behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not yet. She had come to make amends, not to fall apart. "I didn't come looking for you," she admitted. "I told myself I didn't need to. But that wasn't the truth. I was just scared of what I'd find." Her voice cracked slightly. Hollis finally leaned down and began to eat, slow and measured. Calvina watched, breath caught in her chest, as if every bite was proof she was still welcome, even if just barely. She didn't reach out to touch him. Not yet. The space between them wasn't ready to be crossed. But something had shifted. A fragile thread had been laid between past and present, and Calvina could feel it trembling with every breath. As Hollis finished the chicken and sat back, he didn't retreat into the corner of the cage. Instead, he stayed where he was, eyes steady on hers. And for the first time since she walked into that shelter, she let herself believe, maybe just a little, that there was still a story left between them. One neither of them was ready to let go. That evening, Calvina sat at her kitchen table with a spiral notebook she hadn't opened in years. It was old and yellowed at the edges, filled with scattered notes, to-do lists, and clippings from a different version of her life. She flipped through the pages slowly, pausing when she found one with Marvin's handwriting, blocky, precise, almost surgical in its neatness. It was a grocery list, nothing more. Eggs, coffee, chicken thighs. But the weight of it hit her like a wave. It had been so long since she'd seen his writing that she'd forgotten how quiet his presence had been, even on paper. And now, with Hollis back and no trace of Marvin, everything about that silence was starting to feel like a warning she never learned to read. She couldn't ignore the location Drew had mentioned, Route 17 near Landon Falls. That stretch of road had meant nothing to her for years, but now it whispered something more sinister. Calvina remembered driving it once or twice in her 20s, before she'd even met Marvin. It was remote, winding, surrounded by woods that seemed to swallow sound. Why had Marvin ended up there? Why had Hollis returned from that very place, alone? It wasn't just a coincidence. Her instincts, dulled by years of numbness, were now fully awake. She needed to go there. Not tomorrow. Not later. No. Before leaving, she stopped by the shelter once more. Drew was surprised to see her again so soon, but said nothing when she requested to take Hollis out for a walk on the property. "He's calm with you," he said, as if that alone were a miracle. Calvina clipped the leash to Hollis's collar, her hands trembling slightly. He didn't resist. In fact, he followed her with a quiet sense of duty, as though somewhere deep inside, he remembered what it felt like to walk beside her. They made slow laps around the gravel lot behind the shelter. Each step was both familiar and foreign, like muscle memory waking from a long sleep. As the wind picked up, rustling the dry trees lining the edge of the property, Calvina looked down at Hollis and said softly, "You're trying to tell me something, aren't you?" The dog didn't react dramatically, but he paused for a heartbeat longer than usual at the edge of the lot, ears perked in the direction of the woods. He stood still, gaze fixed, as though expecting something to emerge from the trees. Calvina followed his line of sight, but saw nothing, only the shadows of branches waving like slow fingers. Still, her skin prickled. Whatever was waiting for her out there wasn't done with her yet. That night, she packed a flashlight, her coat, and the notebook into the passenger seat of her car. As she turned the key in the ignition, she whispered to herself, "If he left something behind out there, I have to know." The engine rumbled to life, and Hollis, from the back seat, let out a low, almost imperceptible sound. Not a bark, not a growl, just a breath, long and steady, as if he, too, understood that they were finally heading back to where it all ended, or perhaps where it all truly began. Calvina turned onto Route 17 just after sunrise. The road was narrower than she remembered, swallowed by bare trees on either side. Fog lingered low, blurring the edges of everything. Her grip tightened on the wheel as her eyes scanned for the old mailbox Drew mentioned. Hollis was quiet in the back seat, eyes forward, ears perked. When she spotted the box, rusted, crooked, barely readable, her stomach dropped. This was it. This was where he had waited. She parked and stepped out slowly, letting the cold air hit her face. Hollis jumped out after her, immediately sniffing the ground with purpose. The silence here was different, thick, uneasy. Calvina followed as he led her off the road and toward the edge of the woods. Her boots crunched over dead leaves and frozen dirt. They stopped near an old oak tree. Hollis pressed his nose to the bark, then began circling the base. Something had caught his attention. Curious, Calvina knelt down. There were scratches on the tree, faint but deliberate. She ran her fingers over them. Letters. Emmy. That was all she could make out. Her breath hitched. Her heart began to race. Had Marvin been here? Had he marked this tree? Her questions grew louder as the wind stirred around them, whispering things she didn't want to hear. Hollis let out a soft whine, as if to say yes, this was the place. Then came the sound. A soft crack from deeper in the woods. Calvina stiffened, turning her head quickly. Nothing. Just trees swaying. But the tension in Hollis's body told her everything. Something was here. Or had been. She moved slowly as he began to dig at the base of the tree. First dirt. Then a scrap of fabric. She pulled it out gently. Blue flannel. Her heart sank. Marvin's shirt. Underneath the cloth was something harder. Wood. A flat board, buried shallow. Calvina brushed away more dirt. It wasn't random. It had been placed. Hidden. She looked at Hollis, who now sat quietly, watching her. This wasn't just a memory. It was a message. And finally, after all these years, someone was listening. Calvina knelt in the cold dirt, staring at the flat board Hollis had uncovered. Her fingers trembled as she pulled at its edges. It wasn't nailed down, just buried, like someone had wanted it found, but not too easily. She lifted it, revealing a small, shallow space underneath. Inside, there was a plastic bag. Dirty. Fogged from moisture. She carefully pulled it out, wiping the outside with her sleeve. There was something inside. Papers, folded and sealed in another layer of plastic. With unsteady hands, she opened the bag. The first thing she saw was handwriting. Familiar. Tight. Block letters. Marvin. Her breath caught as she unfolded one of the pages. "If you're reading this," it began, "then I didn't come back." Her eyes blurred instantly. It was a letter. Not just one. There were several. Short, fragmented, like thoughts Marvin had written down over time and hidden away. A journal of sorts. Bits of pain, regret, and something else. Fear. She sat back against the tree, letting the words settle in. Marvin had lived here. Not far from this road. Off the grid. Alone. The letters spoke of guilt, of walking away, of not knowing how to explain the weight he carried. Mentions of Calvina were brief, but heavy. He hadn't stopped thinking about her. And about Hollis. "I took him because I couldn't be alone," one note read. "But I think he always missed you." Hollis lay beside her now, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed. "Come." Almost as if he'd known this moment was coming. Calvina reached over and gently placed her hand on his back. He didn't move away. She didn't speak. There were no words to match what she felt. Only a strange kind of peace. Painful, yes. But also full. Real. Marvin hadn't disappeared without reason. He had simply broken under something she never fully saw. She packed the letters carefully, folding them back into the bag. There was more to read, more to understand. But not here. Not now. She looked at Hollis. "Let's go home," she said softly. And this time, when she stood up, he rose with her, no leash needed. Back at home, the house felt different. Not warmer, not colder, just quieter. Calvina sat at the kitchen table with a bag of letters in front of her, the light above flickering softly as if hesitant to shine too bright on what had been buried for so long. She didn't open them right away. Instead, she looked out the window, watching Hollis lie curled near the door, resting, but always alert. That dog had waited for answers she hadn't even known she was seeking. When she finally unfolded the first letter again, her hands were steadier. Marvin's words were simple, almost clipped, but the pain beneath them was raw. "I didn't know how to be loved without feeling like I owed something for it," he had written. That line sat heavy in her chest. She thought back to their quiet dinners, his long silences, and how she used to fill them with noise, hoping he'd speak. But maybe he wasn't silent out of anger. Maybe he was drowning and didn't know how to ask for help. One letter mentioned his father, someone Calvina had only heard about once. A man Marvin had cut ties with, but who, according to the notes, had left behind debts, threats, and unresolved pain. Marvin had tried to protect her from all of it. That explained the distance, the sudden tension, the way he used to double-check the locks at night, even in their small-town neighborhood. And it explained why he left without a goodbye. "I was afraid someone would come for me," the note said. "And I couldn't let them find you." Calvina read each page slowly, as if they might crumble from age or emotion. One by one, the pieces came together. Not just about Marvin's disappearance, but about his love. Flawed. Imperfect. But real. He hadn't stopped caring. He had just lost the strength to carry both his past and their future. And Hollis. Hollis had followed him into that exile and, in the end, had come back carrying what Marvin couldn't, the truth. She glanced over at the dog again. He was watching her now, quietly, without demand. There was trust in that gaze. And perhaps a kind of forgiveness. She rose from her chair and walked over, kneeling beside him. Her hand moved gently to his head, brushing between his ears. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner," she whispered. Hollis leaned into her touch, eyes closing slowly. It wasn't a dramatic moment, just simple, healing stillness. That night, for the first time in years, Calvina didn't feel haunted by the past. She didn't feel angry at Marvin or guilty for what they didn't say. Instead, she felt something closer to understanding. The kind that doesn't erase the pain, but allows you to breathe through it. And in that breath, in that silence, something inside her finally began to let go. The next morning came slowly. Calvina woke before the sun had fully risen, the room still wrapped in the pale blue hush of early light. For the first time in years, she didn't wake up feeling the weight of absence pressing against her chest. Instead, there was something gentler, an ache, yes, but a purposeful one. Like a bruise you press just to remind yourself it's healing. She moved quietly through the house, not wanting to disturb Hollis, though he was already awake, waiting near the front door with that same quiet awareness. She made coffee and sat by the window, the letters spread across the table once more. Marvin's voice was still with her, not loud, not overbearing, but present. His words echoed as she read, "I always thought I'd come back when I was whole again. I just never got there." Calvina stared out at the street, watching the world begin to move outside. People walking dogs. Cars starting. Life continuing. She had once thought her story with Marvin had ended the day he walked away. Now she realized it had just paused. And in some way, it was still unfolding. Later that day, she took Hollis for a walk down the old path behind her neighborhood. It was quiet there, lined with trees, familiar cracks in the pavement from years of wear. She remembered when she and Marvin used to walk this same path, sometimes in silence, sometimes holding hands. She had buried those memories deep, afraid to feel them. But now, they returned not as daggers, but as soft echoes. Hollis walked beside her at a steady pace, never pulling, never rushing. Just present, like he always had been. As they walked, a neighbor passed by, an older man with a weathered baseball cap and a cane. He stopped when he saw Hollis. "That your dog?" he asked. Calvina hesitated, then nodded. "Found him at a shelter," she said. The man studied the dog for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Fine shepherd. Looks like one I used to see with a man, out near Landon Falls. Years back." Calvina's heart skipped. She wanted to ask more, but the man tipped his cap and kept walking, leaving her with more questions than answers. Could Marvin have been seen? Had he been closer than she thought? Back home, she jotted the encounter in her notebook. She didn't know why. Maybe she just needed to hold on to every thread. Hollis lay at her feet, eyes following her movements. There was still so much she didn't know. But one thing had changed. She wasn't running from the past anymore. She was walking toward it, one step at a time. And in that small shift, something in her life had quietly begun to reopen. Calvina spent the afternoon in her small attic, a space she hadn't stepped into in years. Dust floated like snow in the filtered light from the single window. Boxes were stacked unevenly, some labeled, others untouched since Marvin left. She hadn't planned to search for anything. But after the encounter with the neighbor and the letter Marvin wrote about his unfinished fears, something inside her told her the answers might not all be in the woods. They might still be here, in the home he once shared with her. She opened an old box labeled Garage Tools, expecting nothing but rusted screwdrivers and scraps. But beneath the clutter, she found a smaller box, taped shut and wrapped in an old flannel rag. Her stomach tightened as she peeled the tape away. Inside were envelopes, unsent letters, some addressed to her, others not addressed at all. One was simply labeled, "If I disappear." The handwriting was unmistakably Marvin's, and the weight of that one phrase hit her like a punch to the chest. He had prepared for the possibility of vanishing long before he ever did. She read the first letter slowly, her breath shallow. Marvin had written about a man named Ellery, someone from his past, a name Calvina had never heard before. A person Marvin claimed had held onto pieces of me I tried to bury. The writing was vague, cautious, but clear enough to suggest danger. He spoke of debts, promises broken, and guilt, deep, old guilt that had nothing to do with Calvina and everything to do with a life he'd lived before he met her. "If Ellery ever finds me," the letter read, "I won't run again. I'll deal with it. But I won't risk you." Her hands shook. The story she'd told herself for years, that Marvin simply walked away because he gave up, was unraveling. He hadn't left her. He had shielded her. And Hollis. Hollis had been brought along not just as company, but maybe as protection. The dog had always been alert, always watching. Marvin had trusted him with everything. And now, Hollis had brought her back to the pieces Marvin left behind. She sat on the attic floor, the letters in her lap, her head leaning against a dusty beam. Below, she could hear Hollis moving through the house, his paws soft on the hardwood. The house didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt inhabited again, by truth, by memory, by love that had been bruised but never broken. Calvina wiped a tear from her cheek and whispered to the ceiling, "You should have let me carry some of that with you." It wasn't blame, it was sorrow for the years spent apart, when maybe they could have faced it all together. That night, she placed Marvin's letters in a drawer by her bed. Not to forget them, but to keep them close. As she turned off the light, Hollis curled up at the foot of the bed, just like he used to. And for the first time in over a decade, Calvina fell asleep not with questions, but with answers. Calvina thought Marvin left her, but the letters revealed he was protecting her all along. A hidden past, a loyal dog, and a love that never faded. Sometimes, the answers we seek are right at home. Pure emotion in every word. Calvina thought Marvin left her, but the letters revealed he was protecting her all along. A hidden past, a loyal dog, and a love that never faded. Sometimes, the answers we seek are right at home. Pure emotion in every word. The next morning, Calvina stood by the kitchen window, staring at the frost-covered yard with a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. Her mind was no longer clouded with grief. It was sharpened by curiosity and purpose. The name Ellery echoed through her thoughts like a loose thread begging to be pulled. Marvin had protected her from this man, from this piece of his life she never knew existed. But now that Marvin was gone, Calvina felt an obligation not just to remember him, but to understand him. Truly, fully. She brought the letter labeled, "If I disappear," to the dining table and studied every line again. Marvin never mentioned a last name. No address. Just fragments. He spoke of Ellery in past tense, but never confirmed if he was still alive. He had written, "If he comes back, I'll know it's time," which sounded more like a prophecy than a plan. Calvina opened her laptop, dusted from disuse, and searched the name. Dozens of Ellerys filled the screen, most irrelevant. But one article stopped her heart. It was over 12 years old. A man named Ellery Baines, arrested for fraud and suspected in multiple extortion cases. Released 2 years later. No recent records. Calvina leaned back, her thoughts racing. Could this be the same Ellery? The timeline fit. The location, New York State, wasn't far from where she and Marvin had once lived. But there was no picture in the article. No photo to confirm what she feared. She printed it out anyway and pinned it to her corkboard in the hallway. She didn't know exactly what she was building, but piece by piece, she was creating a map of the man Marvin had run from. And the man she might still have to face, if only for closure. Hollis watched her from his spot near the fireplace, his eyes tracking her movements. He hadn't needed much from her since the letters came out. No more tension, no more pacing. It was as if, now that she knew the truth, he could rest too. But Calvina knew the peace was temporary. There was still a loose end. And if Marvin had hidden all of this for so long, then Ellery had to be more than just a bad memory. He was a threat Marvin had never outrun. She decided to visit the old mechanic shop where Marvin had worked for years before he left. It had changed owners since then, but maybe someone still remembered him. Maybe someone had seen something, heard a name, noticed a man asking questions that didn't belong. She jotted down the address, grabbed her keys, and called Hollis to the door. He followed her with no hesitation, like he understood they were chasing something important. As they pulled out of the driveway, the cold morning sun cut through the clouds. Calvina glanced in the rearview mirror at Hollis. His eyes were calm, but focused. He had followed Marvin into the unknown once. Now, he was following her, not just back into the past, but toward something she didn't yet understand. But she would. One way or another, she would. The mechanic shop sat on the edge of town, just past a row of shuttered storefronts and rusted signage that hadn't been touched in years. Calvina parked the car beside the same faded brick wall she and Marvin used to wait near while picking up his paycheck. The place looked smaller now, shrunk by time and memory, but the smell was the same: oil, rubber, and cold metal. She walked inside with slow, deliberate steps, her coat wrapped tight around her and Hollis padding silently behind her. A young man behind the front counter looked up with a polite smile. "Can I help you, ma'am?" She nodded, cleared her throat. "I'm looking for someone who used to work here." Marvin Dorr. It would have been 12, 13 years ago. The man's expression shifted, unsure. "That was before my time. But, hold on." He walked toward the back, disappearing behind a sliding door. Calvina's heart raced as she waited. She hadn't spoken Marvin's full name aloud in so long it felt foreign. Like conjuring a ghost. When the door opened again, a much older man stepped through. He wore thick glasses, a gray flannel jacket, and his hands were stained with grease even after all these years. "You said Marvin Dorr?" he asked. Calvina nodded. "Yeah, I remember him. Quiet guy. Always kept to himself. Worked hard. Then one day, just didn't show up. We figured he moved on. Never heard from him again." His voice softened. "You his wife?" Calvina hesitated. "I was." The old man, Don, his name tag read, nodded slowly. "He was a good man. Never said much about his life. But I do remember one thing. Maybe it means something." Calvina leaned in. Don rubbed the back of his neck. Couple weeks before he vanished, a guy came by asking for him. Rough type. Looked out of place. Said his name was Elroy? No, Ellery. That was it. Marvin didn't say a word. Just turned white as a sheet. Next week, he was gone. Calvina's stomach sank. So Ellery had come looking for him, just as Marvin feared. She closed her eyes for a second, the image of Marvin's anxious nights finally making full sense. He hadn't been paranoid. He'd been hunted. "Do you remember anything else?" she asked. Don shook his head. "Only that Marvin started working late hours. Said it was to catch up on side jobs, but I could tell he was hiding. Afraid of something." He looked down at Hollis. "That your dog?" She smiled faintly. "Used to be his. Now he's ours." Back in the car, Calvina sat still with her hands on the wheel. The engine wasn't running. Hollis sat quietly beside her, his head resting near the gear shift. She turned toward him and whispered, "You saw him change, didn't you?" The dog didn't move, but his eyes met hers, steady and knowing. The past wasn't distant anymore. It was right here, breathing between every truth being uncovered. And if Ellery had been there once, there was a chance he still wasn't far. Calvina spent the rest of the afternoon driving aimlessly through town, trying to calm the growing storm inside her. Every street felt different now, as if shadows from Marvin's past had begun to stretch into her present. She passed familiar places, an old diner they used to visit, the park bench where Marvin once told her he liked the sound of silence, and each one now felt like part of a map she'd never been allowed to see. Hollis sat in the back seat, alert, quiet, as if he too sensed the shift in the air. Back home, Calvina sat on the edge of her bed, reading through Marvin's letters again. Her fingers paused on a line she'd skimmed before, but now read with new eyes. "If Ellery finds me again, it won't be the first time he's come close." The word again hit her hard. This had been a pattern. A cycle. Marvin had spent years running, and she hadn't even known. And now, the question she feared most loomed in her mind. What if Ellery wasn't finished? That night, as she locked the front door, she paused. For years she had locked it out of habit. Tonight, she did it out of caution. Her eyes scanned the street. Nothing out of place. No strange cars. No unfamiliar figures. But something felt watched. Not aggressively. Just observed. Like someone was waiting to see what she'd do next. Hollis paced by the front window before finally lying down near the door, ears slightly raised. He had always been a calm dog. But now he was alert. Focused. She decided to make a copy of Marvin's letters the next morning and store them somewhere safe, just in case. Then she picked up the printed article about Ellery Baines again. There was no photo. No criminal record listed beyond the old charges. But her gut told her he was still out there. Still pulling strings in quiet corners. Maybe even still watching her. She didn't know how far she was willing to go, but she knew this. If Ellery had played a role in Marvin's disappearance, or worse, she wouldn't turn away from the truth. Before going to bed, she stood at the mirror and stared at herself. The woman looking back wasn't the same one from weeks ago. She was older, yes, but also sharper. There was fire in her eyes now. Purpose. She had spent too long living in the fog of not knowing. That time was over. The only way forward was through whatever darkness Marvin had left behind. And she was ready. As she turned off the light, Hollis rose and followed her into the bedroom without a sound. He lay down beside the bed, just as he had in the old days. Not just a companion now, but a guardian. Calvina lay in the dark, listening to his breathing, steady and sure. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The next morning arrived heavy with gray skies and a low wind that scraped against the windows. Calvina stood in the kitchen, staring at the coffee brewing as if it could offer answers. She had barely slept. Marvin's letters, the name Ellery, the visit to the garage, all of it played in a slow loop through her mind. There was something unfinished, something close. And even though no one had come to her door, she felt like a knock could come at any moment. Not loud, just quiet enough to change everything. She pulled out the notebook where she'd been keeping her notes, names, places, dates. Her handwriting was tighter now, more deliberate. She added a new page titled, "What Ellery Wants." But the truth was, she didn't know. Revenge? Money? Silence? Marvin had never said. He'd only written about fear. About the lengths he was willing to go to in order to protect her. That fear was now hers. But with it came something Marvin hadn't allowed himself: action. Calvina decided she needed to visit the county records office. If Ellery had lived anywhere nearby, or been arrested again, it might be in the public records. She called ahead, asked about old property records, arrest reports, aliases. The woman on the phone was polite but unhelpful. "You'll need to come in and search by hand. If it's there, it's in the basement archives. A dead end, maybe. But still a direction." And directions were better than doubt. That afternoon, she packed a small bag, copies of Marvin's letters, a flashlight, her notebook. As she zipped it shut, Hollis sat by the front door, watching her closely. She looked at him and said softly, "You're coming too." He wagged his tail once and stood. No hesitation. He had walked with Marvin through the end of one story. Now he was walking with her into whatever came next. Just before leaving, Calvina paused by the window and scanned the street again. A black car she didn't recognize was parked near the corner, engine off. Her breath caught. Was it new? Had it been there yesterday? She couldn't be sure. It didn't move. No one inside. But she made a note of it anyway. Instinct was whispering louder now. This wasn't paranoia. This was caution earned through grief. As she and Hollis stepped outside, the cold bit at her face. But she didn't stop. The records office was waiting, and maybe, just maybe, the past wasn't finished revealing itself. Not yet. The county records office was colder than she expected. Dimly lit and lined with metal file cabinets, the place felt like it hadn't changed in decades. A woman at the front desk pointed her toward the basement without much conversation, and Calvina descended a narrow set of concrete steps with Hollis right behind her. The scent of old paper and mildew filled the air, mixing with the distant hum of fluorescent lights. She felt like she was stepping into the forgotten corners of time itself. Downstairs, rows of cabinets stretched across the room, labeled with dates and vague codes. Calvina moved slowly, scanning names, cross-referencing anything connected to Ellery Baines. At first, it was a blur: land deeds, business licenses, traffic violations. Nothing useful. But then, tucked in a thin manila folder marked Miscellaneous Inquiries, 2013, she found it, a handwritten complaint from Marvin Dorr. It was brief, half-finished, and never followed up. But the name at the top jumped off the page: Ellery Baines. The document wasn't detailed. It mentioned harassment, old debts, and fear for family. Marvin had filed it just a week before he vanished. There was no second page. No investigator's notes. No follow-up. It was like it had been buried on purpose, or ignored. Calvina felt her chest tighten. He had tried to get help. He hadn't just run. He had reached out, and no one answered. She stood frozen for a moment, the weight of that truth settling like lead in her chest. Hollis suddenly stood at attention. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Calvina turned, heart jumping, but saw nothing, just the flickering hallway light and the open stairwell behind them. "It's okay," she whispered, though she wasn't sure it was. She slipped the file into her bag. Every instinct screamed to leave. Something about this place, about what she had just touched, felt exposed. Vulnerable. Like she wasn't the only one digging through the past. As they climbed the stairs, she could feel the heaviness of Hollis's steps behind her. He stayed close, too close. When they reached the top, she didn't stop to speak to the front desk. She just nodded, tightened her coat, and walked quickly toward the car. The black sedan from earlier was gone. But a different car, a dark blue pickup, now sat a little too close to hers. A man in the driver's seat looked down as she approached, pretending to check his phone. Her pulse quickened. She didn't wait. She and Hollis got in and drove away without looking back. Back home, she locked the door with shaking fingers. She placed the folder on the table, next to Marvin's letters. The pages felt like a puzzle slowly completing itself. But with each new piece, the threat was becoming less abstract. Whoever Ellery was, he was real. And she wasn't just reading Marvin's fear anymore. She was living it. That night, the wind was louder than usual. It howled against the windows like it was trying to warn her of something she couldn't yet see. Calvina sat in the living room with the lights low, the folder from the county office on her lap. She had read it 3 times already, each time slower than the last. Marvin had cried for help. And no one came. That truth carved deep, raw lines into her chest. All those nights she had spent blaming him for leaving, when in fact, he might have been running for his life. Hollis lay at the base of the couch, eyes never fully closing. He shifted every now and then, ears twitching, as if he too knew the storm wasn't just outside. Calvina looked at the window again. She hated how her eyes kept checking the street. Hated how the dark blue pickup haunted her thoughts. She told herself it could have been nothing, a coincidence. But Marvin hadn't believed in coincidences, not after Ellery. And now, neither did she. The knock came just after 10 p.m. 2 slow taps. Soft. Deliberate. Calvina froze. She didn't move from the couch. Hollis was on his feet instantly, stiff and growling low. The knock didn't come again. Just silence. She rose slowly and crossed the room, avoiding the windows, heart pounding so loudly it was hard to think. Through the peephole, she saw only darkness. No silhouette. No shape. But the air felt wrong. Heavy, like something had been there a second earlier. She didn't open the door. She slid the deadbolt into place and backed away, phone in hand. No missed calls. No messages. She didn't call the police. Not yet. What would she even say? That someone knocked and disappeared? That a dead man's past was now sitting outside her house? It sounded insane. But in her bones, she knew better. This wasn't paranoia. This was the past finally stepping into the present. She sat back down, knees trembling slightly, and Hollis returned to his place beside her. She ran her hand gently over his back, grounding herself in his warmth. "We're not going to be afraid," she whispered, mostly to herself. Not anymore. But the truth was, fear wasn't something she could fully push away. Not with everything Marvin had tried to shield her from now pressing at the edges of her life. Upstairs, she pulled the curtain back from her bedroom window just enough to see the street. Empty. But somehow that was worse. She stood there for a long time, watching nothing, and waiting for something she could feel but not name. Morning came, but it brought no relief. The knock from the night before echoed in Calvina's memory like a question without an answer. She had barely slept, waking at every creak of the floorboards and gust of wind against the house. Hollis, ever watchful, never strayed far from her side. He was calm, but alert, more soldier than pet now. There was something in the air neither of them could shake, a presence still unseen, but undoubtedly near. Just before noon, her phone rang. The number was unknown. For a moment, Calvina stared at it, hand hovering. She nearly let it go to voicemail, but something inside told her not to. She answered with a cautious, "Hello?" The voice on the other end was low, steady. "Mail. You've been reading what wasn't meant to be read." Calvina's throat tightened. She didn't respond. The voice continued, "You should leave it alone. The man you're mourning made choices. Dangerous ones. Walk away, and this ends." She swallowed hard, her voice trembling but defiant. "Is this Ellery?" A pause. Then a short, humorless laugh. Names don't matter. But stories do. And you're walking into one you weren't part of." The line went dead. Calvina stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear long after the call ended. Her legs felt weak beneath her. Not because of the fear, but because now she had proof. He was real. He knew her name. And he was watching. She sank into the kitchen chair, mind spinning. Everything Marvin had written was true. Ellery wasn't a ghost from a broken past. He was alive, aware, and still pulling strings. But what did he want now? Marvin was gone. Whatever had existed between them should have died with him. Unless there was something else. Something unfinished. A reason Ellery would still feel threatened by the truth Calvina had uncovered. She stood up and opened the drawer where she'd kept Marvin's original letters. She reread the last one he ever wrote, the ink slightly faded. "If he finds you, do not let fear decide what you do. He feeds off silence. The truth is the only thing louder than him." Those words rang louder now than ever before. Silence had protected Ellery for years. But maybe it was time someone made noise. Calvina knew she couldn't rely on the system. Marvin had tried that and been ignored. She needed help, but not from strangers. She would go to the one person who had stood by Marvin before the end. Someone he trusted. She didn't know where that man was yet. But if Ellery wanted her to stop digging, it meant she was finally getting close. Calvina drove west, past the limits of her small town, into the quieter counties where Marvin once worked odd jobs before settling down. She remembered his stories, brief, fragmented mentions of an old friend named Rhett Norwood. Marvin never said much about him, only that he knew the worst of me and stayed anyway. That was enough. If anyone knew what Marvin had run from, it was Rhett. And now, Calvina needed more than memories. She needed answers. The address took her down a dirt road bordered by pines, where the air grew colder and time seemed to slow. A small cabin stood at the end of the path, smoke curling from its chimney. Hollis perked up in the back seat, tail twitching. As Calvina approached the door, every step felt like crossing a threshold Marvin had once built to keep her out. She knocked twice. A long pause followed. Then, the door creaked open just enough for a pair of weathered eyes to meet hers. "Rhett Norwood?" she asked, voice steady. The man behind the door nodded slowly. "You must be her." Calvina blinked. "You knew I'd come?" Rhett stepped back and opened the door fully. "I didn't know when. But I figured Marvin's silence wouldn't last forever." His voice was rough, but not cold. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and coffee. Papers were scattered on a desk. And in the corner, a photograph. Marvin, younger, with Rhett and Hollis between them. They sat in silence for a moment, then Calvina pulled the folder from her bag. The letters, the complaint Marvin filed, the name Ellery. She laid them on the table. "I need to know the rest," she said. "I need to know what he was running from." Rhett stared at the papers for a long time, then nodded. Ellery wasn't just a debt collector. He was something worse. A manipulator. A man who held information over people's heads. Marvin owed him, yes, but not money. He owed him silence. Calvina leaned in. "Silence about what?" Rhett sighed. "About a job Marvin walked away from. Years ago. Illegal. Dangerous. He saw something he wasn't supposed to. And Ellery never forgave him for it. He used that secret like a leash, until Marvin finally cut it by vanishing." Rhett looked down at Hollis. That dog kept him sane. But even that wasn't enough in the end. The room went still. Calvina felt her chest tighten again, but this time it was with something else. A rising sense that Marvin had done everything he could, and that now it was her turn. "I want to finish this," she said. "I want to bring Ellery's name into the light." For Marvin. For me. Rhett looked at her, long and hard, then gave a single nod. Then you'll need more than letters. You'll need proof. He stood and walked to a locked drawer. And I think Marvin left it with me, knowing someday, someone would be brave enough to use it. Rhett placed the metal box on the table with both hands, as if it held something far heavier than paper. Calvina watched him unlock it with a small brass key, his fingers trembling slightly, not from age, but from memory. Inside, carefully wrapped in a torn piece of denim, was a stack of documents, a flash drive, and an old cassette tape. Rhett unwrapped them slowly. He gave me this the week before he disappeared. Told me never to open it unless someone came asking the right questions. He looked at her. You're asking. Calvina picked up the documents first. They were signed contracts, fake names, falsified business fronts. A web of shell companies Marvin had once been pressured into helping build with Ellery's crew. Laundering money, forging signatures, manipulating public records. It wasn't just criminal. It was dangerous. And Marvin's name was on some of the earliest documents, evidence that could have destroyed him if used against him. But it also proved he had tried to walk away. There were notes in the margins, scribbled in Marvin's familiar, cautious handwriting. This ends with exposure. She slipped the flash drive into her pocket. That would be for later. But it was the cassette tape that made her hesitate. She hadn't seen one in years. Rhett handed her a dusty old tape recorder. He recorded this for you. I never listened. Said it was meant for your voice only. Calvina's hands shook as she pressed the play button. Marvin's voice, softer than she remembered, filled the room. If you're hearing this, I didn't make it back. And I'm sorry. I should have told you everything. But I was trying to keep the worst parts of me away from the best part of my life, you. Tears slid down her cheeks silently as the message continued. Marvin spoke of fear, of mistakes, of the day he chose to disappear. He had spent years believing silence was safer than confession. But now, he begged her to do what he never could. Don't let Ellery stay hidden. Don't let him take anything more from us. The tape ended in static. Hollis, lying near her feet, let out a soft exhale, like even he had been holding his breath. Calvina looked at Rhett. I need to take this public. He nodded. I'll help you. They packed the documents, the drive, the tape, everything. Together, they built a case file. Rhett even gave her the name of a journalist Marvin had once trusted, someone who might actually listen. The plan wasn't to fight Ellery in secret anymore. The plan was to expose him. Loudly. Permanently. As she left the cabin with Hollis at her side and the box in her arms, the weight didn't feel as heavy as it had before. It felt necessary. The truth was no longer a ghost whispering from the past. It was here, in her hands. And this time, Calvina wasn't running. She was ready to face whatever came next. The article went live 3 weeks later. Calvina watched the headline appear on the screen with trembling hands. The man who disappeared to protect the truth, the story of Marvin Dorr. The journalist had done more than publish the documents. He had told the story. Marvin's voice echoed through the audio recording embedded in the piece. His words, once buried in silence and shame, now reached thousands. And with them came something Ellery Baines never expected: exposure. Within days, Ellery's name resurfaced in national forums. Investigations reopened. Old associates turned over details. His quiet power, built on secrets and threats, began to crumble. Calvina didn't celebrate. She simply sat on her porch with Hollis lying beside her, the wind warm for the first time in a long while. Justice wasn't a loud moment. It was this, the soft breath of a world finally exhaling. She visited Marvin's grave that weekend for the first time in years. She brought no flowers, just a copy of the article, folded neatly in her coat. Kneeling in the grass, she placed it beneath the stone, pressed her fingers to his name, and whispered, "I finished it for you." The breeze picked up, rustling the trees gently. And for the first time, her grief didn't feel like a weight. It felt like love, lived, lost, and finally understood. That night, she left the bedroom door open. Hollis curled up near the foot of her bed, eyes half closed but peaceful. There was no fear in the house. No secrets left to carry. Calvina turned off the light and lay back on her pillow. Marvin wasn't coming back. But he hadn't disappeared in vain. He had trusted her with the truth. And now, that truth was free. And in that quiet, beneath the hum of night and the steady breath of the dog who never stopped watching over them, Calvina finally slept. Fully. Deeply. Unafraid. If this story touched your heart, leave a like. It helps us know that stories like Calvina and Hollis's are worth telling. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another emotional and true story. And if you've ever faced a truth from the past, or known someone who has, share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else. Share this video with a friend who needs to remember that even love lost in silence can still find its voice.